Hey there, adventurers and other travelers. Greetings from our channel once more. Today, we're exploring the top 7 must-see locations in Tokyo, Japan's busy capital. Tokyo is home to both ancient and contemporary treasures. So let's get started and get our virtual passports. 1. Sensō-ji Temple in Asakusa District. Our first visit is to the Sensō-ji Temple in the thriving Asakusa neighborhood, which is at the center of Tokyo's culture and history. Tokyo's oldest and busiest temple is a Buddhist temple from antiquity. Before you arrive at the magnificent main temple, go down Nakamai Street, which is dotted with stores selling regional treats and trinkets. 2. Shibuya Crossing and Hachiko Statue. Our next stop is the well-known Shibuya Crossing, frequently referred to as the busiest pedestrian crossing in the world. Watching the throng of people crossing in all directions is a fascinating sight. Don't forget to pay your respects to the neighboring statue honoring the loyalty of an unforgettable dog, Hachiko. 3. Meiji Shrine and Yoyogi Park. Let's enjoy the peace that Meiji Shrine and Yoyogi Park offer. This Shinto temple is tucked away in a woodland and offers a peaceful respite from the bustle of the city. You might even come across customary ceremonies or performances if you take a leisurely stroll in the park. 4. Tokyo Disneyland and DisneySea. Who's up for a little magic and enchantment? If you're a fan of Disney, Tokyo Disneyland and Tokyo DisneySea are must-see attractions. It's a dream come true to become lost in the fascinating world of your favorite characters, experience exhilarating rides, and indulge in mouth-watering food. 5. Akihabara Electric Town. Akihabara Electric Town is a haven for everyone who loves technology and anime. A hub for electronics, gadgets, and everything pop culture, this thriving neighborhood. Discover the multi-story shops, have a look at the newest video game trends, and purchase one-of-a-kind souvenirs that you won't find anywhere else. 6. Odaiba and Rainbow Bridge. Now let's shift gears to the cutting-edge Odaiba neighborhood, where cutting-edge design meets breathtaking waterfront views. For a unique immersive experience, stroll gently across the Rainbow Bridge, take in the expansive landscape, and visit attractions like the Team Lab Borderless Digital Art Museum. 7. Tsukiji Outer Market and Sushi. Last but certainly not least, we're savoring some delicious food at the Tsukiji Outer Market. A seafood lover's heaven, this crowded market is. Enjoy a vibrant assortment of fresh seafood, and don't pass up the chance to taste some of the best sushi in the world. It will be an amazing culinary experience. And that concludes our exhilarating tour of Tokyo's top 7 attractions. Tokyo definitely has much to offer any traveler, from ancient monuments to contemporary wonders. Please remember to like, subscribe, and click the notification bell if you enjoyed this virtual tour so that you can join us on more thrilling journeys. Until then, travelers.